The song which we just sang was written just a few years before the official conflict known as World War I broke out. G.K. Chesterton, a poet and hymn writer and religious leader of his time in England, could have written about many things: a call to arms, a call to hatred, a call to violence. But instead, he wrote words about resisting all of that. Turning one's back on terror, going the extra mile, and seeking, even in that time, to be about peace. The opening hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory, was written by Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was the senior minister at Riverside Church in New York City during the 1930s on through World War II. He wrote that hymn in the mid-1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression here in the United States, when the violence of poverty was devouring people's lives, and also as the drums and sabers of what would eventually become World War II were being rattled all through Europe. And in that time, he wrote not a call to arms, but the words of, "Cure your children's warring madness, bend our lives to your control, shame our reckless, selfish gladness, rich in things and poor in soul. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, make our broken spirits whole." Catherine Lee Bates was a professor of English at Wellesley College. An East Coast woman, she came out to Colorado in the late 1800s and hiked all the way up to the top of Pikes Peak. This was before the days of Gore-Tex. It was before the days when women could wear pants. She hiked it in a long dress and in button-top shoes. Wow, what a woman. And when she got to the top, this New Englander who'd never seen anything higher than the Appalachians, when she got to the top of Pikes Peak, she looked out over purple mountain majesties and waving grains of wheat. And she was inspired to write one of the best-loved American hymns, one that we'll sing at the very end of this service, talking about the beauty of this land, to be sure. But if you sing all of the verses of America the Beautiful, Catherine Lee Bates was concerned not only for the beauty of all creation, but also how it was that we who call ourselves American would live in this land with one another and with the rest of this world. And so yes, she extolled Purple Mountain's majesty and waving fields of grain, but she also wrote, "O beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, may God thy gold refine, till all success be nobleness, and every gain divine. O beautiful for pilgrim feet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control, and liberty in law." She wrote that during a time known as the Gilded Age, when some people were leading gilded lives, but the vast majority of people in this country were falling in the cracks deeper and deeper. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Recently, in March of this past year, Pope Francis went to Egypt. All of his advisors told him not to because it was so dangerous. Just last Christmas, 2 Coptic Christian churches had been bombed on Christmas Eve in Egypt. And with the change of the guard, or the change of leadership that occurred in the last 10 years there, minorities such as Christians are under siege. We read about it just recently when a bus full of pilgrims was bombed. Now, Pope Francis could have said all kinds of things when he went to Egypt. He could have done a call to arms. He didn't. He could have told the Egyptian Christians to strike out against their Muslim neighbors. He didn't do that. What he did instead was, in his sermon, after visiting those bombed out churches and gathering with Christians in Egypt, he told them, and told this world, if we're willing to listen, that for a person of faith, the only true fanaticism must be a fanaticism to love one's neighbor. If you're going to be a fanatic and call yourself a person of faith, Pope Francis said, then be a fanatic for God's love. "2,000 years ago, living in the shadow of the Roman Empire, an empire that had the power of life and death over the people, all people, regardless of who they were, where they lived, what they believed. Someone who took on the name of Peter, because that name was better known than, I don't know, Joe, or whatever name he might have had. Someone who took on the name of Peter to make sure that his letter got read, wrote to early Christian communities to tell them how it is you live as new people, a new creation in Christ. Now, he did not, as, say, the book of Revelation did, call to arms. He did not want them to take on the Roman Empire, but he wanted them to remain true to their faith and true to the ways of the Prince of Peace, in whose ways they sought to follow. He was writing to people who had changed, who had gone from being citizens of the empire and their allegiance to the empire to being citizens of God's new community and having allegiance to the ways of Jesus Christ, the one who taught them to turn the other cheek and to go the other mile, who showed how the power of life can still overcome the power of death itself, how God would be with them even in times of suffering, even in times of despair. And he gave them similar guidance that Jesus had given anyone who would listen to him. Jesus, you might remember, said, when the Pharisees asked him, to whom should we pay taxes? Should we pay taxes to the empire? And Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Now that may sound just like a thing you might say to the IRS at some point. But in fact, it is an incredibly radical statement because it says unequivocally, Caesar is not God. And that's what the empire was saying. And Peter, or whoever wrote this letter, said a similar kind of thing earlier in the chapter from which David was reading, where he says, if you're going to live as free people in the name of Christ in this empire, yes, you can honor the empire. You almost see him putting quotes around it. But you have reverence for God. You stand in awe of God, which, like Jesus is saying, the emperor is not God. And he tells them other ways of how do you live in such a time? How do you live in the midst of such incredible suffering as they were experiencing? Jesus wasn't the only one who was crucified. He wasn't the only one whose family was broken by grief. That happened to Christians and anyone else who defied the empire for hundreds of years. How do you live in the midst of that terror, that suffering? Well, notice what he says. He says, resist the devouring lion. I don't know a better description of evil or sin or violence in this world than from this little teeny Christian book from 2,000 years ago. He portrays all of that, the adversary, as the one like a lion, a ravenous lion that prowls around just waiting for somebody to devour. Well, certainly he could be talking about the empire, because the empire had the power to devour everything and everyone. But I think also he is talking about what can happen to us in such times. I think he's talking not just about the devouring lion out there in the form of the empire or whatever, but also the devouring lion inside that wants to strike back, that wants to fight violence with violence, war with war. The devouring lion that Fosdick sings about, cure your children's warring madness. It's not just the warring madness of the other, it's ours as well. Resist the devouring lion. I don't know about you, but that's something I need to do on a regular basis. Because it is so easy to let that lion of fear, our despair, our hatred, our anger eat us up. Individually, as communities, as a nation. And whoever wrote this letter of Peter's knows that only too well. And so do we. So do we. This last Sunday of Eastertide is also this year the Sunday right before Memorial Day, a day set aside to remember those who have given their lives in the wars of this country. It dates all the way back to that horrible war called the Civil War, the war between the states, not when we were fighting some foreign power, but when we were fighting against ourselves. A war that threatened to devour this nation with hatred and anger. A war that still seems to divide us more often than not. At the end of that war, May 1st, 1865, newly freed African American slaves in Charleston, South Carolina, dug up the bodies of Union soldiers that had been dumped into a mass grave. And they reinterred over the course of the next 2 weeks, every single one in a set-aside cemetery, side by side with those soldiers who had died under the Confederate flag. And then when they were done, they put flowers on all of the graves. Gray and blue, Southerner and Northerner, because they were all united in death. And that became the first Memorial Day. Over time, it became a day in which we remember those who have died and those who have served in all the wars since then. And God knows there have been a ton of them. The so-called Indian Wars, the so-called Banana Wars that we waged in Nicaragua and Guatemala and Honduras in the early 1900s, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, and the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Time and again, my brothers and sisters, we have let the lion of fear and hatred devour us. And somewhere along the way, we must stop. I say that as someone who is the daughter of a World War II vet as someone who is grateful for the sacrifice that was paid. But I also say it as someone who knows how anger and fear and hatred can devour us, and who knows firsthand that wars and their impact do not end when the treaty is finally signed. Several of you have asked why it is I chose to go to Iraq starting next week, June 5th. There are many reasons for doing that. One of them is I was asked. Another is that I have the freedom to do that, and I have your support in doing that. The other is that I think it's a way of putting a human face to that ongoing war. And I've done refugee work in the past when I was a young minister back in Connecticut. But there's another reason. I'll be mainly working and documenting women's empowerment programs in Iraqi refugee camps. And because of the nature of that particular war, most of the people in the 200,000 people that are in the camps around Erbil in Kurdistan, Iraq, are women. Because over the last 20 years, the men have been killed or died in battle or whatever. Husbands, brothers, children, uncles, sons. And in that culture, a woman without a husband, brother, son, uncle is the most vulnerable person in that culture. And so that's where the work's going to be. Working with people, women who have been impacted by an ongoing war. When it comes to Memorial Day in my own life, my brothers and sisters, I not only remember my father and my uncle who died during World War II, and my father who died 10 years later, but I also remember my grandmother and my mother, because the war came home to them, big time. And one of the reasons why, for me at least, refugee work is important is because in 1953, 8 years after the good war had ended, my father, who had been a biology teacher before the war, was a Lieutenant JG serving on a minesweeper up in the Aleutian Islands during the war, who had come out of the war with a 10% mental health disability, but they didn't call it that at that time, but still worked for 8 years as a biologist, researcher, manager of wildlife refuges all around the West. 4 months before I was born, as a result of PTSD from that good war, he had a major psychotic break and was arrested trying to climb the fence at the White House. He was interred at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and my mother, who had 3 children, they had 3 children, and a 4th one on the way, literally had no place to live. They came back, she, thinking my father would be in the hospital for maybe a month or so, came back to Arizona to live with her mother on what she thought was a temporary basis. In refugee language, it's called internal displacement. And most of the refugees in this world are internally displaced. It's not that they've left one country and gone to another, but that somehow war has impacted them so that they have had to move from one place to another. And if I look at it closely, even that good war, which led to my father's PTSD, because that didn't originate with Vietnam, even that good war led to an internal displacement. My mom arrived back at her mother's house in South Phoenix, Arizona, 4 months pregnant with me, 3 little kids, and anything she could carry in suitcases. She never went back to where they had been living on a wildlife refuge. Resist the devouring lion. I know for myself that at times along the way, as a young person and as a young adult, it could have been very easy to have been devoured by despair and anger and even hatred of whoever it was that caused that war. Except that when I was 5 years old, my best friend in neighborhood congregational church was Didi Atsuko, whose parents had been interred in a Japanese-American camp here in this country. My church community, as a young child, took my mom in, made space for 4 little kids, and also continually reminded us of what Pope Francis shared with the Coptic Christians, that the only real thing to give your life for, the only thing to be fanatical about, is God's love for you and for your neighbor. My brothers and sisters, I think we have to remember that in our time. Because we live in a time when it's going to be, if it isn't already, very easy to be devoured by fear, by hatred, by anger, and by war. And we have to resist that. We have to resist it within ourselves, as communities of faith, and as citizens. We have to do what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said when he wrote about the Montgomery bus boycott, when his own people were being set upon by dogs, by police dogs and water cannons, and jailed and lynched. That somewhere along the path of human life, he wrote, someone has to have enough sanity and enough courage to say stop the hate, to say no to the hate, to give oneself to God's way of nonviolent love. It doesn't mean being a complete pacifist, but it does mean trusting that God's love holds you in your fear, in your anger, in your terror. Trusting that as individuals, as churches, and as a nation. Because if we do not resist this devouring lion of violence and fear and war, it will not only do in others, it will do us in. We cannot lose our souls. And what it means to be Christian, my brothers and sisters, is exactly what Pope Francis said it meant. Giving one's life to the love of God, to the love of neighbor, to the love of this world. That's the only fanaticism. It's the only way of being a person of faith. It's what we need to teach our children. It's what we need to teach ourselves. It's what we have to teach this world through our lives. Resist the devouring lion. I cannot think of a time in our history as a nation or in the life of the Christian church when these ancient words from Peter are more needed to become incarnate in our time. And Peter says we don't do it alone. Echoing the words of the song that the choir sang, cast your fears, cast your anxiety, cast your anger, cast your burden upon the Lord. And God will be with you, and God will be with me, and God will be with all of us. And God will cure and can cure this warring madness if only we let God do it. Thanks be to God.